morning, and I want to talk to you a little bit about an event that I was at last night, a presentation that I did alongside two prominent Australians. And then if it leads to any questions, or if you just have any questions in general for me, we can get into that. But last night, the old Zavs Footy Club put on their event called Game Changers. And it's all about getting the young guys and girls who are playing at the footy club access to a night that's all about well-being and mental health and all the stuff that Auckland needs about, which is cool. And they were meant to have a panel of 4 speakers. It was going to be myself, Professor Pat McGorry, who was Australian of the Year in 2010, and he's dedicated his entire life to mental health, mental illness. He's a clinical psychologist, so he trained as a doctor, but most interested in mental illness, and he was part of creating Headspace, the mindfulness app, and he's just done fantastic work in that space. And the 4th speaker was Luke Ball, who everyone will know was number 12 for St Kilda and Collingwood, and now has a role with Essendon. He also led the AFL Players Association at a point, I think, while he was playing. And I think the fun fact about Luke was that he had played in 4 premierships or 4 flags for 2 different teams, which was funny. But anyway, in the end, the 4th speaker, who was meant to be Bridie O'Donnell, couldn't be there, so it was just Pat and Luke and I. But it was a really great night, so luckily they let me go first, which was good because I was a bit scared speaking next to Luke Ball and this other Australian of the Year guy, so I was happy to get up and get my talk done quickly. And the 2 themes that I decided to talk about were how I persevere through challenges, and more importantly, how I sit with discomfort, because I guess in endurance sport, the main thing we're doing is sitting with discomfort, both mental discomfort, negative thoughts, and physical discomfort for a long, long time. And most people are quite interested in how that's done. And my second theme was how we can realize our goals, because setting goals is the relatively easy part that most people are good at, but then the journey to realizing them is where very few succeed. So maybe I'll tell you a bit more about my speech from last night, and then we can have a discussion. So when it comes to persevering through challenges and sitting with discomfort, the key switch that I made was from using cognitive control strategies, where we only want to think positively all the time, and we only want to feel comfortable all the time, and we get quite worried and panicked if we feel any physical or mental discomfort. An example of a race where I was relying on that cognitive control strategy and it didn't work was about 1 year ago, and I actually pulled out. I didn't finish a national championship for the first time. So I was way out in front, about 100 meters in front, and there were maybe 3 kilometers left of the race. But what was going on up in my head was so loud and so negative, and I was really getting into a state of panic because I was so focused on outcomes. I was so focused on the girl behind me, on what the clock was saying, on what people would think, on how it would look if I didn't finish. And I could not cope, and I stepped over the inner barrier and pulled out of the race. And it was about 3 months from then to the Tokyo Olympics, so I really needed to come up with a better strategy of coping with mental discomfort. And I learned about cognitive expansion. And this is where it's a much more mindful approach. It's similar to the accept and commit therapy that I've talked about before, whereby we don't expect to always be feeling comfortable or always to be having positive thoughts. We expect that there's going to be a bit of both. And when those negative thoughts or that bit of physical pain comes along when we're trying to do something, we say, oh, hey, negative thought or bit of leg pain, I was expecting you. And I can cope with you, I can sit with you, as long as I've also got my grit and resilience and drive and values with me. So how I sort of came to learn this skill of sitting with discomfort was from my grandma, who we lost 6 months-ish ago. We lost her just before the Olympics. And for those who don't know, she was a Holocaust survivor. So there can't be many of them left because she was only a 12-year-old girl when the war began. And she lived into her 90s. So she had her sister with her through the entire war, and she's often attributed her sister's optimism as a beacon of light that led to their survival. But it's been really interesting in the last 6 months or so since her passing. I've been trying to dive into her story a bit more, maybe to write her story one day. And I was looking into the difference between optimism and stoicism and what led to a greater chance of survival for those through the Holocaust, and how we can maybe connect that to persevering through our own challenges today. So optimists, like my Nana's sister, who were constantly thinking, we've just got to get to the end of the week, we've just got to get to springtime, we've just got to get to New Year, it'll be over, it'll be over. The optimists were constantly let down and deflated when that day didn't come, and that often led to exhaustion and a reduced chance of survival. That's well documented. On the other hand, people who were more stoic rather than optimistic, like Nana, who was just very present and very grounded. She was never thinking about Liberation Day or when it would be over, or even trying to predict what was going to happen. She was just trying to get to the end of the day to hopefully see her dad at the gate that night to share the piece of bread that she'd found. So this is the key difference between when we're overly optimistic and we're expecting everything to feel good and positive all the time, or when we're fearing potential future outcomes. We basically hand our happiness and our ability to persevere over to some arbitrary event in the future that we're ultimately not in control of, and this robs us of our joy in the present. So the lesson here is, in persevering through challenges and sitting with discomfort, to take on the ideas of the Stoics, and to really think about getting through the day and getting through the next minute rather than projecting our fears forward too much. So that was my lesson from my grandma. And then I spent the rest of the talk sharing with the audience about realizing goals. So let's talk about that now. So as I said, setting goals is the easy part, and there's plenty of goal diaries and journals set up to help you do it. But realizing them is where it takes a bit of trial and error and getting to know yourself. So I always say we need to start by creating the conditions for success. And the conditions for success are quite individual. And this is why self-awareness is so important. So my little tool for self-awareness, and perhaps I'll upload a picture of this to our Instagram later this week, is a simple Venn diagram. It has 3 circles, and you label each circle mind, body, and environment. And where they intersect, in the center of the Venn diagram, you write outcome. And so I had to use this Venn diagram just last week when I had a bit of a meltdown and was feeling overwhelmed by what I'm trying to juggle at the moment. So I haven't spoken to you guys since going back to uni, but basically I'm back to a full-time medical degree now, with also a hell of a lot of training in the lead up to this year's Commonwealth Games and World Championships, with a few side hustles and projects like this on the side. So my cup is very overflowing. And it got to Thursday last week, and I had my first day on GP placement. And I've never been very good with needles or blood and guts. And the GP that I'm shadowing has special interest in dermatology. So he had to do a simple mole excision for a patient. And I was telling myself, you'll be right, you can watch the mole excision. And I did not even last until the scalpel came out. All that was happening was the local anesthetic going in, and I totally fainted. I had this complete negative thought pattern of, you're ridiculous, why are you even bothering with medicine, you don't belong here, How can you not even watch a simple local anesthetic go in? Basically, imposter syndrome. And that little event led to a serious meltdown and a big cry that evening. And I felt totally helpless and lost. So, what I did the next morning was I got up and I pulled out a piece of paper and drew that Venn diagram out, mind, body, environment, circles. And I poured onto paper the helpful and unhelpful environments I'm finding myself in, the helpful and unhelpful thoughts I'm thinking, and the helpful and unhelpful physical states I'm putting myself in. So from that Venn diagram, you can make an action list, and I can't tell you the weight off my shoulders that this enabled. So we start with creating the conditions, and it's not something you only do once, it's something that you do and refine again and again as you find yourself struggling with your balance or trying to overcome a challenging moment. So that's the first key to realizing your goals, continuing to create the conditions for your success by tapping into self-awareness. The second step along the journey is to know what motivates you. So I've recently been speaking to my sports psychologist about the difference between towards and away motivation. And this is something I'd never heard of, but it makes a lot of sense. So the best way I can describe this to you is using two prominent tennis stars that we all know about. So think about Naomi Osaka. She is someone who last year was very vocal, about having this fear-based or away-based motivation. And that's where we're motivated by fear of outcomes, fear of losing, fear of what others will think, fear of what the media are going to ask us, fear of outcomes and uncontrollable factors. And often people who are motivated by fear or have this away-based motivation, they get to the end of their goal or their race or their tennis game, they tick off the goal, and they may feel relief that the fear or the stress is gone, but they don't necessarily feel joy or happiness ever. And I think that's been something that's really derailed Osaka, at the Olympics and time again, which is a shame. On the other hand, think of Dylan Alcott. He is someone who personifies forwards motivation. And what forwards motivation means is where you're totally motivated by the opportunity to explore your values. So when Dylan Alcott was doing his acceptance speech for Australian of the Year earlier in January, he said that tennis and accolades and trophies were about number 30 on his priority list. And what was up at number 1 was his core value of creating space and creating opportunities for people with a disability. So he actually went on to lose the Australian Open just a few days after being crowned Australian of the Year. And he was so gracious in losing, and I really don't think he would have minded, because win or draw or lose, he was succeeding in that pursuit, the pursuit of his value of making space for people with disability. So when we can work towards having forwards-based motivation rather than fear-based motivation, it leads to much, much greater joy and pleasure in what we do, as well as greater longevity, because we're not let down and exhausted every time something doesn't go well. So that's the second key. After self-awareness comes the forwards motivation, where we think about our values more. The next one is about being open to feedback. So I often harp on about the importance of a support network, but what I've been learning over the last year is that it's one thing to have the support network and have people give you feedback, but if you're not open to listening to it, then it's redundant. So I'm someone, I'll admit, that has not always been comfortable with feedback. I often feel that it's a bit of a personal attack, that someone's critiquing who I am rather than what I do, and I really run away from it. But a story happened just 1 week before the Olympic Games. The Australian track and field team were in our little COVID-safe bubble in Cairns, and we were doing our final preparations. There were some biomechanists who came down to the track one day and did some filming. And I decided to forward this footage on of me training to my mum, who's a physio and is quite interested in biomechanics, for critique. And I was ready for her to give me all of the glowing feedback, all of the compliments, to blow my ego even higher. And instead she responded with, "We need to talk, and I'd like to do it on Zoom so that I can share my screen." And I thought, oh my God, what is she about to say? But luckily I'd worked on being open to feedback rather than running away from it. And what we went through from a technical point of view in that Zoom call, and how I was able to stay calm and not take it as a personal attack, was really, really important, because in the end, at the Olympic Games, I got through clean from a judging point of view and I wasn't disqualified, whereas the world record holder who was in the race received a 2-minute penalty for having too many red cards from the judges. And there was another woman from Brazil who was about to claim the bronze medal, and they disqualified her, 100 meters before the finish line. So in the end, being open to feedback paid dividends, and I'll try and continue to take what I do seriously without taking myself too seriously. That's the takeaway. Finally, the key to realizing our goals is celebrating along the way, because otherwise, some of the goals take a very long time to achieve. And I've really found there's a great quote that reminds me about celebrating the process, and that is that the beauty in life lies in the space between the notes. I'll say that again. The beauty in life lies in the space between the notes. So I found this quote at a time when I was struggling again from a mental point of view. So some of you may have heard of post-Olympic blues or post-Olympic depression. And that's basically this concept where you've worked 15 years of your life to get towards this place, and then all of a sudden it's over. And there's this huge come down and readjustment back to life without that carrot dangling, without that real purpose and drive. And I didn't really think I'd be susceptible to post-Olympic depression because I am a fairly even-tempered person. And because it was a games during the pandemic, I didn't really think that there would be such a come down, because it wasn't as incredible as usual. We didn't have family and friends there, etc. But in the end, the months after the games were really weird and challenging. And I found myself feeling as though I was on a hamster wheel, where I had to quickly move on to the next thing, start planning the next goal, working towards the next one. And I kept being told to just enjoy the moment, simmer in it, linger longer, lap up the feeling of just having come sixth in the world. And that was something that's not intuitive for me. So this quote about recognizing the space between the notes, celebrating the small wins, taking pauses along the steps in the journey is not something that comes naturally to me, but I've seen that trying to lean into it is where the growth happens, and it's where we actually extract much more happiness and joy along the journey to realizing goals. And that's what makes them all worthwhile, regardless of whether they actually work out or not. So taking space between each note or along the journey for me means doing a daily gratitude practice. I don't really like gratitude journals. They may work for some people, but I like to just say it out loud. So every night, just before bed, my partner and I will just say what we're grateful for, and then that's been going for like 2 years. So that's what works for me. And it can be something really silly, or it can be something more meaningful, as long as say at least one thing each night. And gratitude's like a muscle. The more you try and say it or write it down, the more you notice what you're grateful for, and I think the better sort of day that you have. Also, just celebrating small things that happen each day that may not seem significant, but when you look back, they really were integral to the journey. So whoever you're sharing dinner with each night or throughout the day, just pausing to really take stock and celebrate where you're at in the journey towards that goal. I think small things like this that encourage us to notice those spaces between the notes are really, really key to succeeding in goals. So I'm going to save the last 5 minutes for questions or discussion, but just to quickly wrap up and give you an overview of what I've said, we talked about persevering through challenges by being able to sit with discomfort because of what we learned from my Nana's story from the Holocaust, where it's much, much more useful to take on a stoic, mellow, present mindset rather than being overly optimistic and projecting fears into the future about what's going to happen. And then we started talking about realizing goals, which was all about starting by creating the conditions for your success using that Venn diagram of mind, body, and environment, and constantly going back to it and making a new one. We talked about the difference between away or fear-based and forwards motivation, where we're motivated by our values, like Dylan Olcott. We talked about being open to feedback and how that can be hard, but by taking what we do seriously without taking ourselves too seriously, we can tap into it. And we talked about the importance of one door opening and another journey closing. That's really nice. And I'm sure even with the cricket, despite not quite reaching your goal, there's plenty of positives that you can extract from the process of trying. I think in the end, like, goals are really nice to tick off, but it's the striving and the process that's the point. That's where we, develop as people and learn stuff and can hopefully make friends and extract a lot of happiness too. So we're right on 7:30 now. Everyone is totally welcome to keep walking. I'll have to get off to training in a moment. I'm going to walk. I've got a nice 12K loop to do around my, from home through Faulkner Park, around the Tan, back through Faulkner and back to the apartment. It's a nice loop I like to do. So does anyone else have comment, question, thoughts for the day? Otherwise, we can say goodbye. Pleasure to walk with everybody. Happy Wednesday.